Hey mamas, this is Playfully Faithful Parenting, and I'm your host, Joy Wendling. I'm a seminary grad and children's and family minister turned stay-at-home mom to my 5 girls. Spiritual parenting is my calling, and it's my passion to help other mamas disciple their kids using the power of play and their own authentic daily walk with Christ. If you're a mama who wants to introduce your kids to Jesus and watch as the Holy Spirit transforms their lives, this is the place for you. I'm so glad you're here. So let's dive in and see how we can partner with God today. Hey mamas, I am so excited to bring you this interview. Please excuse the internet connection glitches and sound quality. Technology issues happen, and right before this interview, my computer needed an update and it took 2 hours. And so I was not able to record on my normal place with my normal equipment, but this interview is so worth it. Mamas, I hope you are inspired to step out of the box in the ways you connect with God on a daily basis from this interview. There's just so much beauty and value in what Christine has to share with us. So here we go.
Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for being here on Playfully Faithful Parenting.
You're welcome. It's a delight to be involved with you.
Would you please introduce yourself to our audience and just share a little bit of background about yourself?
Yes, my name is Christine Sine or Aroney-Sine, depending on how you got introduced to me. I grew up in Australia, trained there as a medical doctor, moved to New Zealand, was in general practice there for about 3 years, and then joined an organization, Youth with a Mission, that at that point had just purchased a ship with the intention of building a hospital on board and doing medical and dental work in different parts of the world. So I had the privilege of actually developing that whole ministry for the part of Youth with a Mission that eventually became Mercy Ships, developing a hospital on board the ship to do cleft lip and palate, eye surgery, medical and dental work. And it really was a privilege, and I got to work all over the world. Part of that was working in refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border and also in Africa, and with Haitian refugees as well, which was a life-transforming kind of experience for me. And then when my husband and I were married in 1992 and I moved to the States, I decided that I would not practice medicine here. My heart in many ways was still in third world medicine. My husband encouraged me to start writing, and my first book was called Tales of a Seasick Doctor, because it was the story of my time on board the ship, the 12 years I'd spent on the ship, and I never got over my seasickness. And so that was kind of the highlight of those years, in some ways highlight or low light, depending on how you want to look at it. But it was the start of a new career and kind of a new way of looking at life for me. And also because of my experiences in the refugee camps in particular, I was really going through a stage of trying to figure out my faith, recognizing that kind of the way I'd learned to pray, the way I'd learned to interact with God just didn't hold water in some ways when I was faced with the kind of life situations that I'd been faced with. I started to get associated with contemplative practices. I was particularly impacted by Henry Nouwen, Thomas Merton. But even those, after a while, I found were not really exactly what I wanted. And so I started to look at more creative approaches to spirituality, really wanted to interact with my prayers, interact with the spiritual observances that I did, and kind of bring them out of every day, I suppose you could say, and into every day at the same time as well. And so it was just a fun kind of progression that I've gone on through my life that has led to me writing more books about contemplative practices, about spiritual practices, and eventually to writing The Gift of Wonder and looking at a more playful, a more interactive kind of way of doing prayer and spiritual observances.
Play and contemplative practices don't typically go together, I think, in people's minds when they, when they hear the word contemplative practice. And even in my own mind, a few years ago, I thought, I was doing children's ministry, and play is just, it's big and it's loud and it's energetic often. And just over the last few years, I've been kind of learning a new sense of play. And I really hear that in your book. So how did you come to learn to be playful?
Well, I think several things. As I said, I started to experiment with different kind of creative ways of interacting with God, of interacting with prayer. I started coloring, though to be honest, that wasn't where I was at. I'm a keen gardener. So I actually, probably the thing that really started me moving in this direction was I started developing or creating contemplative gardens. It started with practicing Advent, the lead up to Christmas. And I started with using Advent wreaths, which I really found fun to start with. But after a while, I got a bit bored with them. And I started looking for something that was a little more creative, a little bit more with where I was at. And as a result of that, instead of creating an Advent wreath, I decided to create a contemplative garden. And so it was just a small garden, one that could sit on my desk. And you could say in some ways it was a garden with an Advent wreath in it, because really what I did in that first garden was that I put candles that were the same as the candles I would have had in an Advent wreath into the garden. And I had so much fun with that the next year I decided to experiment a little bit more and got more and more creative with it in terms of the garden. And then I started to experiment in other ways as well. I started painting leaves as contemplative practice. I started painting rocks, and those, rather than coloring in, I found that those kinds of things really appealed to me. And then I started moving in other directions as well. I would go on a walk, and it was a kind of a contemplative walk, but there were other dimensions to it. More of an awe and wonder kind of dimension. In fact, during the lockdown last year, my husband and I would go on walks every day, and I would call them my awe and wonder walk, because what I would do was that I would look for the things as we walked that gave me a sense of awe and wonder. It was a wonderful spiritual practice, and it was a wonderful playful kind of practice as well. And so that was the way that I drew together the contemplative and fun and play. And, it's kind of like the sky's the limit. I'm always experimenting with new things. When I made apple cider this year, I thought about apple cider as a spiritual practice. When I go out, I walk in the rain. I think of walking in the rain as a spiritual practice. It's kind of thinking about the things that we do on a regular basis and playfully interpreting them as a spiritual practice. It's a great thing to do with kids. I mean, kids, of course, always like to experiment. They always like to reach out in new ways. And so it's something that's really fun for them, I think.
Can you, in your book, you kind of redefine what a lot of people might expect from a spiritual practice. Can you kind of define that for us?
I would call a spiritual practice anything that connects us closer to God. And as far as I'm concerned, anything can connect us to God. I mean, God is present, not just in us, but God is present in every aspect of our world. And I think for me, what I have kind of moved into is a way of looking at spiritual practice that is kind of teasing out, I suppose you could say, the presence of God in the objects around me, in the things I do on an everyday basis, the things I do at different times of the day. And so anything, as far as I'm concerned, can be called a spiritual practice if we kind of look at it in a way that helps to connect us more closely to God.
Absolutely. I've started using changing diapers as a spiritual practice. I think about the way God has cleaned us up and cleaned me up as I'm cleaning my daughter, and just the intimacy of the moment and the intimacy that God desires for me. And then she has this fresh new diaper at the end, and we have this fresh new heart. And, and so I think that it's really important for young moms to be able to develop that idea of spiritual practice, because we can be so busy with kids.
Oh, I agree. And to be honest, I think I really kind of started thinking about some of this in terms of spiritual practice at different times during the day and spiritual practice in everything that we do. When a young friend of mine had her first baby, and she said to me, I cannot do what I was trained to do and have a half-hour quiet time in the morning. She said, it's absolutely impossible. And she said, the most spiritual time for me is when I'm feeding my baby. And, she shared with me how the intimacy of that moment drew her not just closer to her baby, but closer to God as well. And I thought, that's it, particularly for young mums. We shouldn't be encouraging them to try and set aside a half hour or an hour or something to get closer to God. We should be encouraging them to recognize the spirituality of those moments of intimacy that they have with their child. And I think you've given a perfect example, changing a diaper. What a place. Not necessarily
playful.
A place that, a playful kind of way to look at such things. It's beautiful.
Yes, thank you. So how do you think we can help moms to make that mental transition from you need to have a half an hour quiet time to you can grow closer to God throughout the day? How can, do you have any tips or advice on how we can help moms make that transition?
Well, firstly, I suggested to young mums to ask yourself, when do you feel closest to God? I started asking this in workshops that I do. When do you feel closest to God? And what I found, the two major things that people would share with me when they were out with nature and when they were interacting with kids. And it was kind of, again, that was one of the things that started me thinking, okay, why don't we help people to tease out the spirituality of these moments? And I'm sure for young mums in particular, that interacting with their kids in different ways are going to be the times that they feel closest to God. So just, thinking about when are those times and thinking about how can I make this more intentional. I think that's kind of that, how can I make this connection more intentional is the important thing that I would encourage young mums to do. If it's when you're changing a diaper, design a simple practice, just thinking about that. And yes, the cleanliness that can bring. If it's when you're feeding your child, maybe thinking about not only the intimacy that God desires with us, but also the nourishment that we gain from God as a result of feeding on God, as it were. If it's playing with a child, and that's often what people tell me is one of the special times. What is it about playing with a child that makes them feel closer to God? You know, I think that we forget, one of the verses that I use in my book, The Gift of Wonder, is the verse, unless you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom. And what is it about childlikeness that makes us fit for the kingdom? I think that one of the things that makes us fit for the kingdom is playfulness. I think that we think of God as a very serious being. And to be honest, as I've gotten into this kind of spirituality, I've thought, I don't think God, I mean, obviously there are times when God is very serious, but I think there are times when God is very playful. I think there's time when God laughs. There are times when God just expresses the joy of life in the same way that a child does. And watching and interacting with a child as a young mother, has the opportunity to do all the time, can be a very special way of, kind of coming close to God. When I was working on The Gift of Wonder, and kind of thinking, how do I get in touch with my inner child? Because I think that's part of what we're wondering. A good friend of mine said, read children's books. And it's like, yeah, that's a great place to start. And here, most mothers have a chance to do that every day. And so kind of getting in touch with that inner child that then gets them closer to God. Yeah, I think reading children's books is one of the things that I recommend as a great place to start. And as I said, young mums have this opportunity every day. Some of them get totally bored with it because they have to read the same story over and over and over again. But it introduces a kind of playfulness into life and can kind of it unleash the inner child. It can kind of free up parts of our brain to be able to process things in ways that those of us that don't have kids kind of don't think about. So, great thing to do. Think about it as a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Even if you're not reading a spiritual book, it can be a very spiritual practice.
Yes. And that when you were saying that, it reminded me kind of the Israelites and what they were, commanded to do in their parenting and how they passed on the faith. Was they told the same stories.
Told the stories, yes.
Of God over and over and repeated them to their kids when they're waking up, when they're going to bed, when they're on the road, when they're at home. And so it's very, very similar that.
Well, and one of the things I love to do at this time of the year in particular is it's kind of like I give myself permission to go out and buy another couple of children's books that give me a different perspective on the of the Christmas story, because I think we can kind of get set in our ways. The adults can get set in our ways of how we look at the biblical story. And I think we should be constantly growing and learning and expanding our understanding of the story and of who God is as God is revealed in that story. And one of the ways to do that is to buy children's books. That's often a great place to start, and certainly a place that I would recommend for any adult to start. So again, mums have an advantage. They're probably thinking, oh, what's the book I should be out there buying this year? Or, what am I going to read to them this year? And don't read the same books. Find a new one to read. I've got some that I absolutely love. I bought one a few years ago that is, because I like painting on rocks. It's one that has these beautiful photos of rocks, the story in rocks in it, as it were. Just very simple. But again, change the perspective. I've got a couple from Canadians' perspective, not the white Canadian, but the native peoples of Canada. I've got one I bought this year, African American perspective. I've got another one, Native American Indian. I think getting these different kinds of perspectives on the story and how do different people see the story of God is something that really can help us grow in our faith as well. So again, a very playful place to start.
Yes. And I love in your book, you have a chapter about seeing things differently. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the different images of Jesus from around the world. And I just thought, looking at children's art even, and
yes.
how you described that. And it's just such a beautiful thing that, and sometimes when I don't have time to spend as much time in the Word as I would want myself, I can read one of my children's Bibles with them.
Yes.
And the Holy Spirit can speak to me through those stories and those books and the images.
Exactly. Often more profoundly.
Absolutely.
I think, yeah. But you mentioned the art. I've long loved looking at images of the biblical story from different cultures. Some of my favorites come from Africa. And just seeing those in the different ways that they perceive the stories has incredibly enriched my faith. I love some of the more traditional kind of historical kind of views as well. And the practice of what's now called Visio Divina, kind of praying with art, become much more popular over the last few years. And I think it's not surprising because we live in a very visual kind of a society, a very visual culture. And so to kind of not expect to learn about God through images is crazy. I think that looking at kids' images, looking at adult images, all kinds of different ones, and kind of sharing with kids images from other cultures, I think is a great way to educate them about other cultures as well as about the biblical story.
Yes. Have you seen the children's storybook by Archbishop Desmond Tutu called Children of the World storybook?
Yes, very nice. Yeah.
Yes. That one's one of my favorite because of the artists from around the world.
I think that was one I got last year or a couple of years ago. Yes, and they're the kinds of things that I look out for. What I'll do around Christmas time is think, well, what's come out this year? And often it's not a new book that's come out. It's just one that I've kind of, I find the one I got this year is one from Canada. It's called An Aboriginal Carol, but it's a Canadian Aboriginal one, a Huon, I think it is. It's delightful images in it and delightful story as well. I've really enjoyed looking at that. And again, it brings new dimensions to the story for us because, we don't realize how limited our view of the story of God is until we start looking at it from the perspective of other cultures. And we need those perspectives to help us growing, I think, in the ways that God intends us to grow.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think cultures around the world, but even within the different ages and areas of our own country.
Yes.
I think, teenagers have a different culture than I do.
Yes.
And there are things that I can learn from them as well and the way their perspective of
definitely. Yeah.
faith in God. So
Yeah. And so these are really fun kinds of ways to approach spiritual practices, maybe, one of the things that, and I've recommended this, sometimes at this time of the year is, go visit some churches with different perspectives. Now, it's a little challenging still at the moment, but you can, in some ways, it's easier because you can, you can attend services online and see how different they are. Churches of different backgrounds. I actually grew up between my mother was Scottish, my father was Greek. And so I grew up between the Presbyterian and the Greek Orthodox culture. Because it was harder to understand, growing up, I didn't really have much to do with the Greek Orthodox culture at all. But in the last 10 years or so, I have delighted in getting to know more about that culture. And the images and the importance of images, in the Orthodox culture, and recognizing that those images are, because within their churches, part of what they want to do is to recreate something of what they think the kingdom of God could look like. I think, wow, isn't that beautiful? And then another one that I love is there's a French tradition, or I think it's certain parts of France, where the villagers make a manger scene, but they put around the manger, they make little clay figures of all the different people in the village, and they put them around the manger. I think, isn't that beautiful? It's a different perspective of the manger, but I think one that we desperately need. And so looking at different cultures can help us to learn new dimensions, and what a fun thing to do with your kids, to explore these kinds of things.
Yes. And I love the freedom that you express by doing all of these creative practices and being willing to explore new things. And I think sometimes we can get stuck in faith.
Yes.
And it feels like it has to go a certain way. But that's not what we're called to be. We're called to be free in Christ. And I think God is so creative that he wants us to pursue that creative side of ourselves as well. And so I love that it's not black and white with worship.
No. And, as a result of some of these things, I'm not an artist, so I don't do art. But as I said, I've started making contemplative gardens. I've also started writing prayers and poems. If you want a really fun kind of expression of faith, I think writing your own prayers or poems or a combination of such. And I see a proliferation of people who are doing this kind of spiritual practice, because I think that, again, we don't need to just depend on the Psalms. We can write our own prayers. We can write our own poems. I started with kind of writing ones that came out of the Psalms, but kind of moved from there. And I see a lot of my friends doing similar things. And I sometimes have people come up to me and say, "Oh, do you mind that I took one of your prayers and I changed it?" And I said, "No, you should be, because, that was mine. And you need to express it in your way." And so that's another kind of fun expression that we can really enjoy. And again, something to do with your kids. A wonderful thing to do with your kids. Say, "How would you say this?"
Yeah.
And I bet you could, we'd all learn something from how our kids would say it. And yet we often don't give them permission to branch out in that way in expressions of their faith. And yet we need to. I think we desperately need to do that for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think in your book, you talk about Dr. Stuart Brown's play personalities. And I think we also have worship personalities. Something I've been learning with having 5 different kids is that they all relate to God in different ways.
Exactly.
And I have to learn how to teach them their best way to have a relationship with God by getting to know my kids and getting to know God, and then helping them to find their way.
And giving them permission to express that relationship in the way that is most comfortable for them. not saying this is the way we should do it. Because, when I was a young Christian, and I think this is true for most of us, we're told this is the way you should do it, and I found it boring the way that I was told. And it's kind of like, it wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading the Bible. I loved reading the Bible. And it wasn't that I didn't enjoy praying. I loved praying, but I found that doing the way that I was told that I should do Bible study and things like that, and of course this was for me 50 years ago, it became boring. And I was looking for something else, but I felt that I wasn't allowed to try anything else. And I think that fortunately, because of my life experiences, it kind of encouraged me to be more creative. But a lot of people, I really think a lot of people move away from faith because they're not given permission to think outside the box in terms of spiritual practices. They're not given permission to be creative, because it's like, are we going to move away from God? And I think that, occasionally people do, but I think they're more likely to move away from God when we don't give them permission to be creative than if we do give them permission to be creative.
Yes. So, I've loved this conversation and I could keep going. But do you have any final tips for moms to connect with God? I think you shared some great ones earlier, but just for moms who have busy schedules and have this feeling of this is, they don't have that permission yet to think outside of the box. What, any final tips or thoughts for them?
I would just say, listen to and watch your kids. Learn from them, because I think kids have, or many of them, have a closeness to God that adults have lost. Again, that verse, unless you become like children. I think we should be learning from kids. I've looked at some of the stories in the New Testament and reinterpreted them in light of that scripture. One of my favorites is the fish and the loaves. Jesus, this kid, and of course we see this art that so often this one little boy comes to Jesus, and I think it wouldn't have been like that. Can you imagine it? I can imagine this boy came, all of his friends came with him. They were giggling, they were carrying on, they were pushing him forward because they believed that Jesus could perform a miracle. And I think one of the things we need to realize is that often it's the kids who have more faith in God, Jesus's ability to transform us than we do. And so I would say to mums, listen to your kids. Learn from your kids. Ask them, about what they would see. How do you think mummy can come closer to God? I bet they're much more perceptive than we realize. I haven't had any kids, so I'm not talking from that personal experience, but I am talking from the experience of watching a lot of kids, talking to a lot of mums. And as I said, just my own ongoing experimentation and the joy that has brought to me, in a way that has lightened up my perception of who God is. And yes, definitely brought far more joy than, I could ever have imagined there would have been in my relationship with God.
Thank you. That's great. I know you have an Advent retreat coming up soon. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, it's called Walking with Wonder through Advent. And it's on November 20th. And a good friend of mine, one of the most creative people I know, Lily Lewin, and I will be doing a 3-hour retreat there'll be a lot of interaction. We do make it a very creative kind of a retreat. And if people can't, they say, that's already booked. it's being recorded. And, if you sign up, if you register and sign up, you will get the recording and you can watch it at your own leisure. Or we will also be putting it as an online course, hopefully just a couple of days after that. And people will be able to access it in that way as well. So 3 options of how you can interact. Now, obviously, being live means that you have a chance to ask questions that the other 2 options don't tend to give you. But I think, people really seem to enjoy this very creative way that my friend Lily and I have of doing retreats. So it's not just I'm going to talk to you for 3 hours in a Zoom call. It is a very creative and interactive kind of a retreat. So we're expecting to have some fun. So I hope that the people that attend, I know, Joy, you're signed up for it.
I am.
So I hope that it is a fun experience for people.
I'm looking forward to it. And I think it will be really good. I'm just excited to be able to kind of put into practice some of, what I've been reading from in your book and this conversation, and to have you walk me through some of the things that you talk about in the books. So as we prepare our hearts for Advent, so I'm really looking forward to that and kind of seeing that play in action.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, and The Gift of Wonder was a fun book to write. And it is a fun book still, I find, to talk about, to do retreats about. It usually kind of energizes me to think about new forms of creativity too.
Yes. Every time I finished a chapter, I was like, oh, that's my favorite chapter. And then I'd read the next one. Oh, no, this one's my favorite chapter. And
oh, well, thank you.
Yes. So, it was it's really beautiful. And I've got so many ideas of things that I want to incorporate into my own faith and our family's Advent and preparation, and even this month for Thanksgiving. The gratitude chapter was just all these ideas are flowing. So I'm just really excited.
Oh, good.
So finally, if my listeners want to connect with you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, my website is godspacelight.com. And I blog once a week there, but the blog is a community blog. So I've recruited others, including my friend Lily. So something new goes up every day onto the blog. And then we have other resources available there too. Some online courses. In fact, there was one that was done a couple of months ago that we did on a season of gratitude that people are using at the moment for the Thanksgiving kind of season. Lots of prayer resources on the blog and other forms of spiritual resources as well that people can access in that way. So godspacelight.com.
Great. And I will put a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And just thank you so much, Christine, for being here and taking time on Saturday to meet with me and just encourage these moms that they have the resources they need and the time that they need to connect with God right in front of them. And just that intentionality and creativity is kind of we just need to change focus and our understanding of spiritual practices. So,
Great.
Thank you so much. And it has been a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure for me too.
Well, mamas, that's it for today. Thanks for joining me on Playfully Faithful Parenting. I'd love to keep the conversation going over on the socials. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you felt encouraged or equipped by today's show, do me a favor and leave a review. I can't wait to hear your story. Till next week, keep playing and pointing those littles to Christ.